This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joe Cohen from Queens College.
I'm Leslie Hinkson from Georgetown University.
And I'm Gabriel Rossman from UCLA.
Today we're happy to sit down with Brian McCabe of Georgetown University. Brian's work sits at the intersection of inequality, politics, and urban planning, and he's the author of No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership with Oxford University Press. And now he's working on housing vouchers and the way the public authorities administer voucher programs. We're going to talk about home ownership and its role in shaping people's fortunes and the country. You're not going to want to miss this. So a few months ago, we spoke about the Sokol Squared hoax, in which three scholars sent a bunch of hoax articles to the studies journals and got how many? Something like 7 publications out of it? Something like that. In any case, the hoax got major national attention. It was certainly discussion worthy. It angered people who said that it wasted reviewers' time and it capitalized on the trust that we place in each other when we're developing our literatures. But others loved it, right? They saw it as exposing unrigorous work in the academy. So in any case, it turns out that only one of the 3 authors of this hoax had a faculty position. I think his name, I hope I don't pronounce this wrong, Peter Boghossian?
I think you pronounce it Boghossian.
Boghossian, I think.
Boghossian, okay. Boghossian, a philosopher from Portland State University. And now Professor Boghossian has had a professional misconduct charge levied against him for the hoax because he didn't go to IRB, is my understanding. So what's your take on this story? Is this researcher misconduct or the use of IRB as a means of retaliation? What was your reaction to this story?
Well, go ahead.
My reaction to the story was, I felt like I couldn't make a call on it because I don't know if he and his codes thought of this as actually research that was systematic, or was this just for fun? Mm-hmm. And it seems as though, I mean, I've never heard them refer to it as fun, but I have heard them.
You didn't watch their YouTube video when they're laughing their ass off.
Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, I didn't watch that one. Yeah. So I don't know. Intent, I think is very necessary to know, because if they weren't approaching this like research, the way that we think of research, I really don't see what IRB has to do with this.
Right.
Well, okay, so this is like this weird Aristotelian thing about IRB, where I can do whatever I want until it's research, and then I have to go fill out, a bunch of paperwork and wait a month before I can do it. So if I want to have a conversation with you because we're old friends from graduate school, that's nobody's business but you and I. Mm-hmm. And if I want to have a conversation with you because it's a qualitative interview that's going to go in my next book, then I need to, write up an idea of what kind of questions I'm going to ask. I need to talk about the scientific impact. I need to talk about if you're a member of a vulnerable population. I'm going to talk about if there's, compensation. I'm going to talk about what you're going to get out of the study. I'm going to talk about if your arm suddenly falls off during the study, what are the protocols, all the stuff. And then I'm going to need to submit it to IRB, and then I'm going to need to wait a week. And then they'll say, what if Leslie Hinkson is a minor? And I'm going to say, I know her, she's in her 40s. And they're like, yeah, but how are you going to verify that? And I'm going to have to go back. And
first of all, a week, you're lucky.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but all that hinges on whether it's just a conversation because we're old friends from grad school, or whether it's for research. So we have this kind of ridiculous thing where for research purposes, you have to do all these hoops. And it's kind of ridiculous to me because why does it matter that much whether it's research or not? I mean, I understand that that's the rule.
Right.
But it does seem somewhat absurd that if they're writing it for Aereo and Quillette and all that sort of thing, and YouTube, and that's not research, then they don't have to. And if they're doing it for ASR, that would be research, and they would have to go through IRB. It's a little bit ridiculous.
Brian, what's your
And
take? Oh, sorry. Go, Gabe. Finish up.
no, I was done.
No, I mean, I actually think in some ways the question is a lot more simple than it's been laid out, right? So IRB is meant to protect human subjects, or at least, right, that's the stated purpose of IRB. It's probably actually meant to protect universities against getting sued, but the stated
Totally.
is to protect human subjects. And at the end of the day, the truth is that in this sort of scam that these guys ran, right, there are no human subjects because there's no actual research. So nobody needed to be protected, and therefore, right, there sort of needs to be no IRB approval. I mean, I think that the research misconduct allegation is true. I can't imagine the situation where this is for fun, right? This is obviously to prove a point that they think is true. And I think that there are other ways to sanction them, right? Professional misconduct doesn't have to be just through sort of research boards. So that's, sort of my take is it's clear professional misconduct, but it's not clear that it's a violation of IRB because it actually doesn't involve any human subjects. And
but it does, Brian.
Well, who does it involve?
Well, I mean, as much as we might despise them, are not the editors of journals human beings?
Well,
and the peer reviewers.
That's an open question, but no. But I mean, actually, I think if you take that argument to sort of the next step, does that mean that every time I'm asked to review an article in the AJS, I have to get IRB approval because I'm interacting with an editor of a journal and the writer?
No. The idea would be that you'd have to get. So I mean, this is one of the things is that when the first wave of the controversy about this thing, people were like, "Oh, it's so unethical to deceive people," and then people were pointing out that in some ways this is just an audit study.
Yeah,
and people love audit studies.
Right.
But the reason they love audit studies is because A, it's proving a point that we're sympathetic to, which is that there's various forms of discrimination that exist and we need to worry about them. And B, it's wasting the time of people we don't care about that much, which is HR managers or small business people. Whereas this is making a point we are unsympathetic to, which is that there's bullshit in academia that should be weeded out. And B, it's wasting the time of people we are sympathetic to, which is fellow academics. So, but in a purely structural perspective, this is just an audit experiment. And audit experiments are very obviously research involving research subjects.
Well, but it's not really just an audit study because it doesn't rise to the level of what we would expect of an audit study, right? An audit sends out, thousands of resumes.
Yeah, the sample size is smaller. It's not necessarily as systematic of a design.
But
it's not like they send it out to every third listing in Monster.com between this week and that week.
Sure. And even had they gotten IRB approval to do this so-called audit study, right? It doesn't rise to the level of scientific. It doesn't have scientific merit, and not because of the subject, but because if you send out 20 fake articles, try to get them published, right? That's not really an audit study.
I think it's ironic that we're talking about, whether it's low quality research when the whole point of the study was to demonstrate that there's substantial parts of academia that you can be very successful with extremely low quality research.
Right.
My experience in dealing with IRB on things on the line, for example, with this podcast, is the standard is are you trying to develop generalized propositions about people's behavior? Are you trying to develop theories like scholastic theories that generalize? And
they were.
I guess
they were trying to generalize a systematic knowledge that certain subfields of academia are full of shit.
I guess so. Although, I mean, I guess in a way you could see it as that. I also see it, though, as a stunt. Like, they weren't trying to assess rejection rates. They were trying to get a paper into a journal to embarrass the journal.
Well,
so there wasn't an assessment there. It was like
that's true, but they also want to have it both ways, and that they have in multiple occasions referred to this as an experiment. And at the time, I mean, this is one of those things where it's like people change their arguments, where people who were unsympathetic to them would say, oh, it's not an experiment because there's not a control or because it's not well designed or whatever. And now the shoe's on the other foot. And their position has to be, it's not an experiment. It was just a prank. And then the people who don't like them has to say it was an experiment. Or say that it counts as research, So it's completely opportunistic on both sides to say whether it's research or not. But I think it was very clearly aimed at developing, and I'm doing my best to bracket my opinions on the merits. And I'm basically sympathetic to their prank/experiment because I do basically hate most of cultural studies and want to see it called out as bullshit. But I do think that they were trying to develop a general point of understanding, at least as much as many things that are considered research.
So here's another aspect of it, because there's two angles to research misconduct. There's sort of the legalistic definition where we're worried about like the university's conformity to government regulation, and then there's like the spirit of IRB, like what IRB is intended to do. And I was having a very interesting discussion with a Canadian scholar who was talking to me about human subject standards in Canada as opposed to the US. And if I'm mistaken, somebody please correct me on Twitter, but I think in Canada, if you study people in the course of their job, like you study people's behavior when they're working, they're not human subjects, like in terms of their job. So you can do sort of employee assessments of their normal course of work. If I'm not mistaken, somebody can correct me on this.
That's similar to the standard in the Susan Fiske report, but that hasn't been implemented yet. So what you're describing as the Canadian standard is what, God willing, will soon be the American standard, but it kind of hasn't worked its way through yet. But it's coming down the pike. A couple of years ago, Susan Fiske of Princeton wrote a report basically saying, wait, is she at Princeton or Penn? Anyway, so somewhere in central Jersey. She lives in Princeton. Her report said that you should have, where am I going with this? That we should have basically that standard that is already the case in Canada.
Like you can study people at work.
Yeah, and you don't have to fill out these ridiculous things that are based on an essentially medical example of the presumption that if you ask someone what's your favorite color, that it might give them cancer.
Yeah. And I'm mostly sympathetic to Boghossian just because I don't see anonymous journal reviewers and journal editors where like we don't even know who okayed this line. I don't see people's reputation as being, subject to any serious risk. I think it was not.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I think
if you were the editor of one of these journals, if you knew that your colleague, now fortunately, not every sociology journal desk rejected it, but no sociology journal gave them an R&R. Whereas most of the cultural studies journals did give them R&Rs or accepts.
It was
so that I think that's it. And that's what I wrote in the Weekly Standard, is I pointed out that this shows that sociology is great and cultural studies full of shit. But
no, it's damaging to the discipline. But like, unless
but I think it would be damaging to the individual editor if you knew that. Let's say your colleague.
But if you knew,
let's say that, but you would know it was in every newspaper. It was in the Wall Street Journal. So let's say that you knew that you had a colleague who you sometimes have lunch with who's in the gender studies department. And this colleague edits a journal called, I don't know, Studies in Queering the Body or something like that. And then they publish a study in there on how you can make men woke by anally inserting a dildo.
Yes. As they did. Let me just explain, as the so-called hoax thing.
That was one of their studies. Yes, I'm not.
Yeah, just so we're clear, Gabriel's not just riffing here.
Yeah, I'm not just telling you about my weekend. I'm telling you about one of the so-called squared hoaxes. Right. So and you learn that your colleague had published this paper. You would lose respect for this colleague, and one of the critics of it. Of the paper, who was quoted in Inside Higher Ed, described them as slandering fields. Now, I don't think it's a slander, because truth is a defense against slander.
Right.
Now, the only case where I think they bordered on slander is in their original. They since have kind of incorporated my critique that actually sociology came across great. But in their original write-ups, they made it seem like sociologists were buying into their nonsense.
Right.
When actually there's a very clear distinction there. And so in that respect, you could say that they kind of slandered, say, sociological theory, where, for instance, they took David Schreiber, who's my grad student, was one of the reviewers. And I can say this because he said it publicly.
Right.
And he thought, he actually texted me and said, like, I got this crazy paper to review.
Yeah.
And And then he reviewed it and he tried to give constructive criticism, but there was no way he was going to accept it.
Yeah.
And then they took the constructive criticism and then treated that as if someone was taking the paper seriously.
Right.
So I would say that they slandered anonymous reviewer 2 at Sociological Theory, who turns out to be David Sharp.
But there's nobody who's personally going to be impacted by like that. Whoever's the editor-in-chief can say one of the editors did it. Whoever's editing the journal can say some other editor did it.
Okay, so David was anonymous until he outed himself.
Exactly.
But Mustafa Emmenbayer's not. Like that.
Well, was he the one who ultimately okayed the journal or the articles?
Well, he was the one who decided to send it out for review instead of desk rejecting it. So this could, to some incremental extent, this would have hurt Emmenbayer's reputation that he sent it out for review instead of desk rejecting it.
I guess I don't.
Although, I don't know. Like in some ways, in some ways, I kind of feel like that desk reject thing. I could see where an editor would be like, you know what, this is peer review, not editor review. So I'll send it out, and I might think this is BS. Let's see what the young folks say.
Yeah, I don't think anybody. I don't think anybody's career is going to be materially damaged by it. So maybe there are disciplines or that are going to be damaged by it, and certainly journals. But individually, I don't think anybody's going to pay the price. And the price that they pay, I don't feel terribly for them because
because they publish crap.
Well, yeah, so.
Well, actually, I do have another point I want to make, which is, let's say that they did this the right way. So let's say that they went out there and now Lindsay and Pluckrose are not affiliated with universities, although they are trained scholars. So they wouldn't have had an IRB to go to. Mm-hmm. But let's say that Boghossian had gone to the Portland State IRB and filed it. I don't think it would have been possible. And I don't think that's because it is an unethical study. I don't see anything less ethical about this study than your average audit study. Mm-hmm. And, I know somebody could say when somebody reviews a resume where you're comparing one resume with a college application, with a college degree and 3 years of experience, and it says Everett Adams on it versus another resume that has, a college degree, an MA, and 4 years of experience, and it says Tanisha Washington on it. You're still wasting people's time. I get, but you're wasting 5 minutes of time versus 10 hours of time. I get that. But I still fundamentally don't see this as qualitatively different from an audit study. I see this as basically an audit study. So let's say that they did the thing that, the late Diva Pager would have had to do, or my next door neighbor, Michael Gaddis, would have had to do, of going through IRB to do an audit study. Mm-hmm. And I think you simply couldn't have done it and for two reasons. Not because you shouldn't. Like if I was on the IRB, I would say, I'm curious to see what happens. Let's do this. Mm-hmm. And then, send the debriefing email and everything like that. But fundamentally you can do it the same way you can do any other important study that involves deception. And honestly, for all the talk about this is low value research, I think this is much more important. We learned much more from the study than we learned from most studies.
Oh, yeah.
The average, this is I would say we actually learned more from the study than say my last ASR. And it's not like I'm not.
We've talked about it 3 episodes.
Yeah, exactly.
There's plenty of fodder for reflection with this.
Exactly.
With this
yeah, it taught us a lot about academia and how it works. This is a successful study.
Yes.
Now the reason I think you couldn't do it is that I think most IRBs would say you can't do it, and I think most IRBs would say it's unethical. And I don't think they have a good reason for saying it's unethical, or certainly that's any more unethical than any other audit study. And then I also think that even if they did say it's ethical, somebody would leak it.
Oh, there's no question. It's a small community. And the first debrief you gave that said, I'm sending bullshit papers to, this and this studies discipline, word would spread immediately. And
yeah. So I think there's a real issue here, and I'm torn by this because in principle, I think that studies that involved, so I generally think that most things should be exempt from IRB. Mm-hmm. And that if I take you out for a cup of coffee and I talk to you, especially if I'm keeping you anonymous, I should not have to go through IRB for that. Mm-hmm. But I think studies that involve deception, actually should involve IRB. Like that's actually something where I think, should be kind of a hard and fast line of like, then it has to go through IRB. It probably get accepted, but you should have to go through IRB for something that involves deception. But on the other hand, I feel like this is the kind of thing where it would lead to effectively an abuse of power on the part of IRB's part, where they think because this attacks our people and it inconveniences our people, and it shows a point that we don't like, they might effectively use the pressure point of IRB to either deny the study or to leak the intentions of the study, which is effectively the same thing. Whereas they wouldn't do that if it's demonstrating a point they like, which is that there's labor market discrimination against people who they don't care about, which is, say, HR managers. So I got a banter item, which is that on Twitter yesterday, Tina Fettner and Daniel Larson and a few other people were talking about, and apologies to anybody I forgot, we're talking about that, it kind of sucks that the ASA submission process comes at the second week of January. I'm old enough to remember, you guys are, well, we all went to grad school together. We're all the same age. We're all old enough to remember when there was the kind of annual crashing of the server, which in effect was a line extension. But, I guess now they discovered Amazon cloud computing. They can, but, it used to always be like, it's due January 7th and the server would crash every January 7th.
And nobody would learn their lesson the next year.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Well, you didn't have to, right? Because you knew that there would be an extension.
Yeah.
But anyway, you have this 9-month lead time because it's always the second or third week of August before ASA, and it's like that's a really long time, especially given that you have the whole paper.
Right.
And, sometimes people have said like, well, maybe we should have it be that it's like a 4-month lead time and you submit the whole paper. Then the thing that gets back to you is like, well, it takes, a month and a half to put the schedule together once you have the papers. And it takes, 2 months to put together a panel because that's a lot of peer review. And I've done it multiple times. It actually is a tremendous peer review effort to go through, 100 paper submissions and put together a couple of panels.
Good Lord.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of work. And if somebody told me I had a week to do it, I'd say, no way, But so the real answer to speed it up is to make it less work. And the way to make it less work for both the submitters and the peer reviewers is to make it as just an extended abstract rather than a full paper or at least half a paper, because 20 pages is short by sociology standards. And a lot of disciplines do this, and it generally works for them, right? An extended abstract, right, which is to say basically about 500 words, is a very common way to do conference submissions.
Well,
I did a computational social science, and I submitted an extended abstract. And then the other thing, which I'd like to talk about a little later, is that I got in as a poster, and I went to the conference because it was a poster. At ASA, that would have been a roundtable, and I wouldn't have gone.
Right.
But let's talk about the extended abstracts first.
Right.
Okay, so here's the thing. So I know, I have gone through that review process myself for both SSSP and for ASA. And you're right, it's a lot of work. But at the same time, I always thought that part of this was just this weeding out process where they were like, you know what, if we allow extended abstracts, instead of getting 115 submissions, we're going to get 2,000 submissions. I'm totally exaggerating.
Really? I feel like the first approximation you submit a paper, like I'm not going to submit 2 papers. I'm going to submit 1 paper to ASA most years. And if it's extended abstracts, I'm not going to submit 5 extended abstracts. I'm still going to submit 1 extended abstract. I know, but how many people will have a completed paper? That's what I'm saying. I know you're not going to submit multiples. What I'm saying is more people will be able to submit an extended abstract by that deadline than would be able to submit a completed paper. So maybe I would submit a paper or an abstract every year instead of submitting submitting a paper every other year.
Well, the conference itself would be more like the ESS, I guess, right? It would change I think the tenor of the presentations. And also, like, let's be honest, you could have that deadline in April and everybody would just wait till mid-March, right? And they'd be like, oh, why is it April? I just need it till May. Like, we've all been on the other side of deadlines, like waiting for them and setting them. And almost invariably, the people who you set it for feel like they could use just an extra 2 weeks, regardless of where you set it.
I mean, so my sense is that, in some ways what happens is, so I did a panel last year, a housing panel, and 2 of the 5 papers that I ultimately accepted onto the panel came out in published form around the same time as the ASA. Right? So, what that meant was that...
So they were able to incorporate a lot of feedback in the typesetting phase.
Right. Just in the typesetting phase. But I mean, it sort of raised this question for me about sort of what the purpose of presenting at the ASA is, right? So is it to do some sort of paper that's in progress and get that feedback? And if that's the case, then sort of like late stage final papers, right, should not be submitted. But or is it just to sort of alert the sociological community to the work that you're doing by sort of having you stand up there and present something that's almost done? I mean, I go to APAM every year to the public policy conference, and I mean they have a sort of a different problem. It's extended abstracts, and they put panels together. Groups of people submit panels, right, which is a classic in lots of other disciplines too, where you can get 3 or 4 or 5 of your colleagues, friends, people in your social network and submit an actual panel. In some ways it works a lot better because you get these sort of very coherent panels. I find that at ASA quite often you have papers that sort of don't seem to fit together, and they're sort of, broadly stuck under the category of welfare state or broadly stuck under poverty, but they don't have a lot of relationship to each other. Whereas APAM, you get panels that actually can deal really nicely with each other. I mean, the flip side of that is you get this sort of reproduction of the same scholars every year that a couple people are finding their friends. And then, I've been on a housing panel for the last 4 years with some combination of the same 10 people. So it doesn't always create an opportunity to be involved in it unless you're sort of already in the club. But I think it's an alternative that solves a bunch of problems of the ASA.
You know what? It's like to follow up on that, this idea about panels and getting feedback, what is up? Like, what is up with sessions where there's supposedly a discussant, but like no one gives you feedback on the panel, gives you any feedback on your work, and they just open it up for the audience? That's one of my biggest pet peeves. If you are a discussant, what is your job?
I hate discussants.
Well, they know, Leslie, that the paper is already about to be published. So
yeah.
Also, I mean, the problem with being a discussant is you have these papers that were just the 5 best papers on race, or the 5 best papers on housing, or the 5 best papers on personal finance, or whatever. But they have nothing to do with each other other than the topic. And kind of the genre conventions of being a discussant is you have to draw out a common theme, and it's incredibly contrived. It's inevitably the most boring part of the talk. So I would add that to my list of, once I'm made dictator for life of ASA, no discussants.
Well, Gabriel, I have to totally disagree with you on that, because I have been to sessions where there have been masterful discussants who have been able to draw, like things in commonalities with the papers, while also giving meaningful feedback and weaving it all together. I mean, it's a skill, right? And I actually think that a lot of people who sign up to be discussants are just really crappy at it.
Well, also, you don't always sign up. Like every time the ASA rolls through New York, you're like, will you please be discussing on these 4 panels? Because a keyword on one of your papers matches one of the papers on the panel. So it's like, it's not everybody who is a discussant was clamoring for it. You know what I mean? Although you should say no if you're not clamoring for it.
Yeah.
Let's be sure. But also, like, what's the function of, what's the function of these ASA meetings? Is it a public showcase of research that's already been done? Because if that's the case, it's a very, very inefficient way of communicating new research. Like the internet's here. We don't all have to gather and deliver it orally. Like, You could be interviewed.
Well, the round tables are the extreme of this. Nobody sees the round table. The only purpose of the round table is so that you can tell your university's comptroller, or whatever they're called, that you appeared on the conference program, so you can pay for a vacation where you get to visit your friends from grad school out of your research budget.
I don't know. I think we're being. Come on.
Yeah.
Let's be a little more positive about this.
I mean,
you do realize to whom you're speaking, right?
Yes. Yes.
My best experience at the ASA actually in a decade of going was on a round table. And I will say, I had that one experience and then I've never done a round table since. But I remember it was in San Francisco, like 2009. And I sat down and there were two other people at that table. They happened to be Sarah Cowan and Dave Brady. And we had the best conversation for an hour, right, that I've ever had at ASA about sort of academic work. So, that's, I'm sure, the exception more so than the rule. But it was a sort of really enlightening experience as a fourth year grad student to have that. So, it doesn't happen often, but every now and then the roundtable comes through.
It's good for junior scholars, I think. First of all, we already did a section on roundtables versus posters. Because I've been.
Oh, okay. So we don't need to go back to that yet.
We don't need to go too back. Like, I think we pretty much fleshed out our views, but I think they're good. The hit rate's lower. Most of them aren't good, but they still. I mean, look, the hit rate's not that high on panel presentations. The hit rate's not that high on main stage plenary sessions. Quite candidly, right?
Yeah.
Like you attend 20 presentations and you get like 3 or 4.
Oh, plenary sessions suck.
Generally,
I mean, it's almost part of the nature of them.
They need headliners, I guess. And now we turn to Brian McCabe of Georgetown University. Brian authored No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership with Oxford University Press. It's a book that talks about home ownership and its role in Americans' personal economic fortunes and its central role in American society. It's a fascinating topic and a pleasure to meet you. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
So home ownership is a big thing in America, and I thought maybe you could get us started by painting us a picture of how housing and home ownership specifically shapes people's personal fortunes. Like, how important is home ownership in the big picture of how well people do?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the beginning of the book is when you ask people about sort of what constitutes the American dream, right? Sending your kids off to college, doing better than your parents did, sort of climbing the social ladder. Owning a home continues to be sort of at the very, very top of that list. And what was sort of striking to me, I wrote the beginning of this book kind of on the heels of the housing crisis, is that commitment to home ownership sort of didn't dip very much. It did not dip very much, right? So there was this sort of brief period where home ownership seemed a little bit less important, but it sort of rebounded very quickly to continue to be sort of one of the things that Americans hold dear. And so that's sort of kind of how I got started in the book, thinking about the different reasons that people want to buy a home, right? And so the kind of one that we go back to the most is the promise of building wealth through home ownership. But there are a lot of other reasons when you talk to people about why they want to own a home, about what they say, right? So they talk about having a place that's theirs, the security of home ownership, right? The sort of the idea of building communities through home ownership, of staying in a place for a long time. So it's not just the kind of financial side of home ownership that's important to people, but it's all these other kind of aspects of it. And in thinking about home ownership as a sociologist, part of what I wanted to do was kind of wrestle this idea away from economists. I feel like economists have been the sort of primary researchers on home ownership to the degree that we think of this as mostly about building wealth, kind of ceded control to the economists. In the book, I wanted to kind of bring some other sociological ideas about strengthening communities and about civic engagement and some of the other meaning around home ownership back.
So what do you get for owning a home?
Well, I own a condo and it's an extraordinary headache. But what do you get? So I think that there are financial returns on it, right? And I say in the book, the kind of consensus is that if you have a good mortgage in a good neighborhood and you hold on to it for a long time, right? Home ownership still is one of the best wealth building tools that we have. But you get a lot of other things from it too. I think people get a sense of security, kind of physical security, right? A place that they often feel safe. There's I think a really important social status associated with it, right? This idea that we sort of see homeowners as people that have succeeded, that have done well, that are, independent, that sort of made it. So there's that part of it. There are some other benefits that I don't talk about in the book, but benefits, health benefits associated with home ownership, sort of mental health benefits, right? Sort of knowing that your payments are not going to change month to month. They're not going to change very much month to month. So I think that there are still a lot of benefits that individuals do see from home ownership.
I've done a little bit of work on home ownership, and one thing that struck me in doing my book was how home ownership is sort of like the ticket to accessing the neighborhoods with good schools and the neighborhoods, with quality public services and good
Yeah.
hospitals and libraries. Like in America, these communities tend to do their best to restrict cheap rental housing,
Yeah.
and so some of owning a home is just being able to get into non-distressed communities.
Yeah, and I mean that's actually the one of the central points of the book, right? Is to say that we tend to think of homeowners as sort of being more involved in their communities, right? They're better citizens. They vote more often. They volunteer more often. They attend, PTA meetings, and they do volunteer work, and they're kind of more active citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do in the book is to sort of think about why that's the case, right? What are they protecting? And I argue that some of this is just about residential stability. Homeowners are in a place for a longer time, and sort of stability leads to greater involvement in communities. But some of this, of course, is about protecting property values, right? So when a homeowner is working to make sure that a land use they don't want is in their neighborhood, when they're working to oppose affordable housing developments, right? That kind of stuff that shows up when we measure community engagement and political participation, right? That stuff's also not always good for a community, or not always good for a community as a whole. And so that's part of what I want to do in the book, is to say that homeowners do tend to be more involved in their communities than renters, but there are, right, often very negative consequences of this kind of exclusionary politics of being involved as a way to keep other people out of your neighborhood.
Well, so one of the things I would say about that, so first of all, I want to say I did read the book, really loved it, as you know, but I will say that I really do think that one of the reasons why homeowners are more involved than renters is because that's how the system is set up, right? And I think very often renters are actually made to feel as though they don't have as much of a say, right? And so if that's how the system is set up, right, then what can be done? What kinds of policies can you implement to try and sort of like undo that kind of hierarchy that exists, like between renters and homeowners in certain spaces? That's number one. And number two, I actually think that there are some, in some places, even in suburbia, like Montgomery County, where I live, in Maryland, where they're totally building up the downtown, right? And they're building these luxury apartment buildings. Well, Montgomery County has a provision that says, well, if you are building a residential space that has more than X number of units, you need to set aside this many units, right, as affordable housing.
Right.
And number one, that's one of the ways in which you get lower income, and that includes, poverty level, working class, and also lower middle class residents to move into a high rent, if you will, district, right? That does have really good schools, that does have great services, while also, helping to alleviate any kind of fear that many of the residents, even in such a quote unquote liberal county, that they will be overrun by the have-nots.
Yeah.
Oh, come on. The problem with that is that it just raises the costs. And so perversely inclusive zoning, can actually lead to less construction, because if you say, you can only...
Not in Bethesda.
Well, maybe in Bethesda because DC is such a hot market. But in general, if you say half the units have to be reserved, or a third of the units have to be reserved for non-market rate housing, you're effectively driving up the cost of, the profitable units, meaning that you can only build super luxury units. And, you arguably would get, I know housing people who say, and maybe Brian disagrees with this, but or maybe it's just a different skill set that would be required for this analysis. But I know housing people who say that you would get more construction with if you just didn't have the requirements for inclusive zoning. And it's probably true that the new construction would mostly be luxury housing, but it would be cheaper luxury housing. It would be $3,000 a month for a 2-bedroom instead of $4,000 a month for a new bedroom, which is what new construction costs in Los Angeles. And also through housing filtering, you would end up getting the socioeconomic mix anyway. So for instance, if they didn't have those types of requirements, I would probably move into new construction and pay $3,000 a month. And then some poorer person would move into my apartment. And so you'd still have more economic diversity and lower rents.
Well, here's the thing. I don't know. So Gabriel, I totally get your point. I think one of the big takeaway points from what you said, initially, at least, is that, different policies actually work better like in different places. So you need to be really careful about like thinking about having these blanket policies. And then, but also number two, I think part of the rationale for doing this isn't, I mean, it's to ensure that low income people aren't segregated perpetually from everyone else. So, I mean,
it wouldn't be perpetually. You'd get filtering. It may, in the short run, you might, but once the construction gets to be a few years old, it would be less valuable. And then you would get housing filtering, and you'd have more of a
just
mix.
for background, filtering is a process where
it's a vacancy chain for apartments. So
yeah, so like when somebody builds a really nice apartment,
the new apartments go to rich people, because when you build a new apartment, it only costs an extra couple $1,000s to put in marble countertops and that kind of shit that mean you can double the rent. And then and so it's way worth it to make a luxury. It only costs 10% more to make a luxury apartment than it does to make a non-luxury apartment. So of course you're going to make a luxury apartment because you can charge twice as much, and the construction costs are
marginally higher.
Nothing. Yeah. And so to first approximation, all new construction is luxury construction. But after a building is 20 years old, it's not that luxurious anymore. It's a little bit out of fashion. It's starting to get worn down. The paint looks like shit. Right. So
pass it down to the pros.
That's not what
I don't.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, Brian. Sorry, we digress.
Sorry,
there.
Brian, go.
I almost had to run over to your office, Leslie, to get on the mic. No, I mean, I think, filtering happens in a world of economists, right? Where we think outside of constraints, right? So filtering with like if you think of trading in your car after 3 years, right? You make a little more money now, you want a new car. The cost of trading in your car is extremely low, right? You don't have a social network around your car. Your church isn't in the neighborhood where your car is, right? So people actually don't sort of filter housing in the way that we think of it as this sort of easy commodity where you just make a little bit more money and you get a better house, and a couple of years later you make a little more money and you get a bigger house, right? It's just sort of
you can still keep all those Tebow goods if you just move within the same neighborhood.
Well, right, but there's cost of doing that too, and housing is so spatially segregated that if you want to upgrade from from one apartment to the next, right, you often can't just do it in the same neighborhood with the same sort of walkable things. I mean, I think you do make a good point about the supply constraints, right? So what we want to do, and what people that sort of advocate for sort of this is just a supply problem, is we need to lift supply constraints that limit the amount of housing construction that's happening. So we're working on a project in DC, sort of DC Metro, looking though at where it is that new housing construction is happening. And what's fascinating about it, and this is the story of, kind of all metros right now, is it's happening in the exurbs, right? In places that are really, really sort of far away from the central city. I think, the Bethesda example is really interesting to me because I think there's also this sort of misnomer, and I talk about it a bit in the book, about what affordable housing actually means, right? Mm-hmm. So in Bethesda, right, they're probably using tax credit dollars to build, to build LIHTC units, affordable units in these mixed income developments. And those are probably geared at people making 60% of the median income, right? So in DC, kind of DC Metro, the median income is $110,000. So 60% is, $65,000. So we're not actually talking about housing like poor families or low income families, or even like we're basically talking about like very middle income families.
It's above the national median.
Right,
Well, so the one thing I will say about that, Brian, and this is again just a Montgomery County example, is that you're totally right. The vast majority of the people who end up actually applying for these for these units, right, actually are right where it is you're saying. But I also know people who make significantly less money than that, who also were able to secure spaces in these luxury buildings.
Right, but the rents in those buildings are going to be set so that somebody making $65,000 doesn't have to pay more than a third of their income, 30% of their income. So it is true that people that make less money can get those units, but at a rent that's affordable to somebody making $65,000, right? So they're cost burdened because they're living in this unit that was actually, built and financed for a wealthier family than them. I mean, this is the sort of fundamental problem with our low income housing policy is we're actually not building housing for the very, very bottom, right? Because we've taken the state almost entirely out of it, turned it over exclusively to the market, and there's no sort of financial, right? There's no financial way to build housing for somebody making 20.
No, but you don't build housing for poor people. You build housing for rich and middle class people, and then eventually it degrades, and then the salvage value is housing for poor people.
Well, that's the American way. That's not the only possible system.
Exactly.
No, it's not the American way. The American way is you don't build housing at all.
If there was an American way, that would be the American way.
Yeah. So Brian, one of the things that I thought your book made very clear to people who aren't who don't have any knowledge of the ways in which government policies have actually led to, number one, not just encouraging home ownership, but also limiting like sort of the prospects of home ownership for certain types of people. And I was wondering if you'd want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a chapter in the book that's about the mortgage interest deduction. When we talk about the subsidies that we give to housing in the U.S., right? We talk about housing vouchers and tax credits, but the mortgage interest deduction is one of the largest deductions in the federal tax code. Right, goes exclusively to homeowners, obviously, but not just to homeowners, to homeowners that itemize their deductions, right? So it goes to kind of upper middle class and upper class homeowners, and I have some graphs in the book that just sort of show how unequal the deduction is.
Should you still be using the present tense?
What's that?
Should you still be using the present tense?
Oh yeah, I mean the change in deductible income was from $1 million mortgages to $750,000 mortgages. I mean, it's very. We should still be using the present tense. Yeah. I mean, the standard deduction went up, right? So
in Los Angeles, I'd like you to show me a place that I could get for $750,000. You make a great realtor if you could find one for me.
Right.
So and then on top of that, the state and local tax deduction went away. So I mean, to the extent that housing prices are especially rising in basically blue states, big cities and blue states, we should eventually see some change from the last year's tax bill, because some of those subsidies have been clawed back incrementally. I mean, I agree with you that there's still big subsidies for housing in our tax policy, but not quite as bad as 2 years ago.
Well, but I mean, even if that's the case, so I agree with you, not quite as bad as 2 years ago. I mean, the federal government spends $100 billion subsidizing home mortgages last year, $20 billion on the entire housing choice voucher program, right? The sort of primary tool that we have for assisting low income housing. So you're right to say that 2019 maybe better than 2018, but it's still extraordinary compared to the amount of money that we spend on low income rental programs, right?
Yeah.
And these are, and homeowners making a substantial amount of money, those of us that itemize our taxes, right? We're sort of the least in need of housing subsidy, right. And we're the primary beneficiary of it. So I think the principle still stands, even if, they've been sort of slightly clawed back.
Oh, I agree with you completely that mortgage interest deduction is still a middle class entitlement. And in general, a lot of middle class entitlements dwarf transfers to the poor. But sure. I am saying that there has been some improvement on that.
Absolutely, some marginal improvement. But I think
Sure, agreed.
the other thing to put it in, right, is not only is like, so it's right, it's costly, it's really expensive to the federal government, it's regressive, it doesn't actually help sort of poor families for sure, or even middle class families on the margins of home ownership, right? So unless you itemize your deductions, right, you're not going to be able to take it. So it's not the kind of tool that even incentivizes people that are almost able to buy a home. Now, I would contend that that might not be the best goal of housing policy anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want that to be the goal of housing policy, if we want to encourage people to own their own homes, right, the mortgage interest deduction is sort of not even good for that. And then you sort of add on to it, I think, the argument from the book, which is that it's sort of encouraging people in their communities to sort of clamp down and protect their property values, sort of at all costs, and sort of the cost of it is more inclusive communities.
So, Brian, in the perfect world, in the universe that is totally orchestrated by Brian McCabe,
Yeah.
what, and specifically in an urban American universe,
Right.
what would be your primary mechanisms for not even for, I wouldn't even say for ensuring home ownership. I would basically say for ensuring people having a home.
Yeah.
Or how about just well-being, like people's overall well-being.
Well, we're talking about housing here, dude.
Well, yeah, but housing is not just the space you live in. Like in America, it's a vehicle for accessing other essential services,
Right.
and like it's not just about living indoors.
It's true.
There's a lot that
Yeah,
you're
true.
buying a lot more than just a space to live when you buy a house.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that there are ways to think about sort of decoupling the idea of home ownership from lots of the benefits that go with it, right?
Yeah.
So we might think that there are benefits to residential stability, right? The ability to stay in a neighborhood that you know and near the services that are important to you and in your social networks, right? And so we can imagine even for low-income renters or renters in a city like Los Angeles, right, that are being displaced as neighborhoods change and gentrify and they can't afford those rents, right? We can imagine some sort of subsidy, like a gentrification subsidy or a voucher-like subsidy that enables us to sort of decouple the idea of like residential stability and subsidize that, right? So we could do that.
Right.
I think that there are some other models of home ownership that are not the kind of standard, like buy a house in the suburbs, kind of put all your money in that investment and then sort of do everything you can to make that property value go up. We can think of, there are examples of shared equity co-ops, right? There are examples of land trust, community land trust. So I think that the sort of, in my mind, the policy goal is to kind of decouple all of these things from each other, to think about ways that we can help people build wealth that might be outside of home ownership. Right now, we sort of see it as the primary tool for building wealth in the United States. And it is a good tool, but it doesn't have to be the only one. And then to think of all these sort of attenuant benefits that we get from home ownership and to kind of unravel them from that.
I remember reading about home ownership. Like if you are in a well-heeled neighborhood that manages to insulate itself, it's a good investment. But I remember hearing that on average, real estate is a poor investment. On average, like the annual returns are low if you buy the typical home. But the typical home might be like a home in York, Pennsylvania, or
Well, I think that my sense is that what your sort of average economist would say is that if you get a standard 30-year mortgage, if you buy it in a decent neighborhood and if you hold on to it for a long time, right, you're sort of the way you're making money in the end is by regularly paying down your mortgage loan. Now, some of us, right, might own in Los Angeles or DC and buy at a time just before kind of housing values skyrocket. And so we're making money in two ways, right? By climbing housing prices and by paying down a loan. But that's the sort of caveat, I think, to all of it, which is that, right, it's a long-term mortgage in a decent neighborhood where property values are at least stable and held for a long time, and it ends up still being a good.
So what I understand, if I understand you correctly,
wait, can I push back a little on that though? Can I push?
Well, let me just jump in. So what I understand, and I kind of agree with this, is like, let's say that you had a choice between paying $2,000 a month in rent and then taking $1,000 a month and putting it in an index fund, or paying $3,000 for a mortgage. Right. And in some mathematical model that some finance economist has published somewhere, they'd say that you could make, in the median neighborhood, you could make more money with the index fund. But the problem with that is nobody's going to actually stick to putting that money in the index fund.
Well,
there's going to be a time where it's like you want to go to Disney World, or your kid needs braces or whatever, and so you don't, you don't do the investment that one. Whereas the mortgage, you have to do the mortgage, so it's basically a commitment device to force you to save.
Well, hold on though. But there's a very important qualifier in what Brian's saying and what that the economists are saying. In a decent neighborhood is what he's saying, and that's an important qualifier. So, for example, it's my understanding that the one major explanation of Black families' difficulty accumulating wealth.
Yeah, I was thinking that it's a huge explanation for the black-white wealth gap.
Yes, that their homes are not appreciating like the economically segregated white neighborhoods. And if you get a genuinely middle class house, like that's a house that's $200, $300. Like when you talk to economists or professors in general, they are 10%ers, right? And they are purchasing what they consider decent is in fact very nice.
Right.
And it's not a vehicle that would be available to somebody earning 40 grand a year who might only have a budget of 200,000. And those are neighborhoods. A house of $200,000 is going to have some downside potential in its housing. It could be in the Midwest where the city goes bottom up, or anyhow. Sorry, Brian, go.
And I think also, I mean, the Gabriel, the trade-off that you made of either $3,000 going to homeownership or $2,000 going to rent and $1,000 in index fund, right? Those aren't sort of comparable housing units, right? A $2,000 rental and a $3,000 ownership unit. I think, right, the way a lot of people would think about it is you have $2,000 going to rent or $2,000 going to homeownership, and at least, right, your $2,000 going to homeownership, a certain amount of that pays down your principal every year. So in the long run, when you go to sell your home and pay back the bank, right, you owe sort of a lot less money on your mortgage.
Well, I agree that that's true on average, but there's certainly you can certainly engineer it that way, right? So I know someone who rents a unit in a condo building.
Yeah.
All the other neighbors own their condos, or at least most of them do. This person is renting a unit from someone who owns the condo and is paying much less in rent than they would be paying in a mortgage, but they're also not building equity.
Right.
So in that case, they versus their neighbor actually are making precisely that calculation.
But there's
am I going to pay $2,000 for rent and then maybe save $1,000 in an index fund, or am I going to pay $3,000 and build equity?
Right.
But I agree with you that in general, when you rent, you're getting an apartment, it's in a denser neighborhood and blah, blah, blah. But it is possible to rent a house in a single family neighborhood, or to, buy a condo. I mean, it's not 100% correlated.
Yeah, but also there's like a very American aspect of this, because like I think in part people systematically overpay for their housing because the penalties of living below your means are larger here in the United States than they are elsewhere. And
you realize that I know that this is implicitly, everything's better in Canada, but you guys have a bubble and we don't anymore.
Well, I mean, we'll see how it all plays out.
We'll see.
A 10-year depression.
You really think that housing prices in Vancouver are going to keep skyrocketing?
Not forever, no.
No, I'm talking about in the U.S. I'm sure there are bubbles in places in the U.S. today.
No, but the main point
in the U.S. it's mostly tied to job growth.
No, but the main point is not the main point that I'm making is because the United States has much less redistribution across local communities. If I, let's say, were an upper middle class person and I wanted to save money on my housing and put that money in an index fund, I would go live in a lower middle class neighborhood, and the penalties for, like, in terms of my child's school funding or maybe in terms of my infrastructure access, I feel like the penalties are very high in the United States for living below your means. And it gives you much less room to save money on housing. And I think everybody's systematically crowding into neighborhoods that are above their means.
Well, you're kind of approaching the argument that Warren made when she was still an academic with two-income trap and that sort of thing.
I'm a very big fan of hers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, okay, Brian. So, we're here asking you to be a policy wizard, but you are actually working on a project looking at a specific policy mechanism, namely housing vouchers. So, do you want to talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So I've gone from thinking about policy at the kind of top of the distribution, right, the mortgage interest deduction, to thinking about policy at the bottom of the income distribution, right, about housing vouchers. So the sort of quick background story, right, housing vouchers Section 8 vouchers is what we commonly call them. If you win a housing voucher, you pay 30% of your income, and then the federal government pays the rest. 30% of your income towards rent, and the federal government pays the rest of the rent through a local public housing authority like the DC Housing Authority or the Housing Authority of the City of Los Angeles or something like that. So what's interesting to me about this is that housing vouchers are not an entitlement program. In fact, housing vouchers are lotteried off. They're basically people have to sign up for a wait list. And you sign up for a wait list, and when your name gets called, when you get to the top of the wait list, you get your housing voucher. It's a really extraordinary system because there's thousands of public housing authorities in the U.S., and they all distribute their housing vouchers in different ways. So, for example, the DC Housing Authority had their voucher wait list open for decades, and they closed it a couple of years ago. The city has 14,000 vouchers. When they closed the wait list, there were 70,000 people on it. There was some extraordinary statistic, like the wait time for a one-bedroom apartment with a voucher was going to be 28 years. And it's in some ways an extreme example, but actually not really. I mean, LA had their wait list closed for 13 years. They opened it up in 2017 for 2 weeks. Cities around the country are doing this. So the next project is actually about that system. It's about this kind of system of wait lists and lotteries and how it is that local housing authorities make decisions about when to open their wait list and when to close it. How to select tenants, kind of different local preferences that they might have, and what it means for the country, for our kind of welfare state, for the social safety net, to run our housing assistance programs as a lottery rather than an entitlement program. I always tell people, like, imagine if Medicaid, right, was run by a lottery, right?
Yeah.
You sign up for a period, a quarter of you would get it, and the other 3/4 of you wouldn't. Or if food stamps, right, were run by a lottery, right? You can only sign up when the wait list opens in 5 years. If you're lucky enough to get on the list, you might have to wait 4 or 5 years before you get your food stamps, right? But it's a really fascinating sort of program where we treat essentially equal people, right, eligible households, differently based on whether or not you're a winner of the lottery. So,
well, that's great for research purposes.
Oh yeah, no, it is.
That's why he's doing it, Gabriel.
Yeah,
it's great for research purposes. It's less good for public policy, but it's great for research purposes.
Why aren't they just building housing? Why doesn't the government just build a ton of housing, create like residential subdivisions, and make a train there?
Well, we
you used to be a Tory.
No, I'm not. This is like why? Well, first of all, I mean, if it eases pressure,
like, why can't we have the People's Working Housing Block?
Well, the government did do that. They did build big housing.
Yeah, and it was such a success.
Well, what specifically failed about it? Like, why is it not viable? And what couldn't they figure out and had them just give up on things?
Well, fundamentally, what happens is it created concentrated poverty. And it became very unpleasant places to live, which is why they switched to Section 8 from concentrated housing projects, kind of the Great Society model.
Yeah, and I think that's the big answer, is that public housing developments concentrated poverty and disadvantage in certain neighborhoods and segregated neighborhoods. But there are in between models too, right? So there was a program where the federal or the local housing authorities would lease private units and then sublease them to tenants, right? So the local government becomes the intermediary. They're not building units, but they're leasing units. There are ways that we're incentivizing private development through like tax credits, like we were talking about earlier. So I think that I actually think the answer is, and this will be the kind of final chapter of my next book, is I don't think that you can house poor people based on a market solution alone, and we sort of turn this over entirely to the market. That there needs to be some government intervention in building people for whom the market will never build housing. But yeah, I mean, we're sort of out of the business of building public housing, and we're actually in the business of tearing down public housing. Originally, the most distressed public housing through Hope 6, and now this transformation of the public housing stock through a program called RAD, which is essentially like privatizing the public housing stock. So that's certainly not the moment that we're at in the U.S. We haven't been there for a while, where the government has a sort of real role in building housing.
Yeah, or subsidizing it the way they would subsidize middle class housing with the same vigor,
Right. Yep. It does
All
mean
right.
I've gotten to travel to like scores of public housing authorities. I think by the time this project is over, I probably will have visited more public housing authorities across the country to do interviews. That'll be my Guinness
What's your
Book of World.
take on them? Are they very modern and like innovative thinking, or does it feel like an old fashioned utility when you're engaging them? Like, are they thinking about new housing models? And
Yeah, yeah, no, some of them it's really fascinating. There's some very, very innovative public housing authorities. There's about 40 agencies that have a designation from HUD as moving to work agencies, which basically gives them kind of flexibility to innovate around program rules.
Mhm.
So there's a ton of interesting things kind of happening in public housing authorities on the ground. And the variation is wide. Some of them are kind of very standard, like running a very standard program. And some of them are thinking really seriously about questions of self-sufficiency, about increasing the housing stock, about how you spread like scarce resources to help people that are the most at need. So there are a lot of innovative programs around it, but yeah, it varies, place to place.
You've been listening to The Annex, a sociology podcast. Special thank you to Brian McCabe of Georgetown University. Brian wrote No Place Like Home, Wealth, Community, and the Politics of Home Ownership with Oxford University Press. We're on the web, theannexpodcast.com, on Twitter @Sociannex, and on Facebook, The Annex Sociology Podcast. Our producer is Liseth Moreno. And a very special welcome to Kanwal Latif, a new member of the Sociocast crew here in Queens, New York. Welcome. On behalf of Leslie Hinkson and Gabriel Rossman, I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.